or incompetent authorities on borders. Trade and investment, it was setting the basis for proper capital movements and capital protection, as well as trade and compensation. Trade and competition, beginning to put into place anti-dumping and other controls. New negotiations were planned to start the round formally in Seattle, but of course that was stalled in part due to civil unrest, the rumble in Seattle, as well as very clear messaging from the developing world that they were not prepared to move on this initial agenda. There had to be change. So in 2000, 4 years later, negotiations on agriculture and services began as separate negotiations, but they were in 2001 actually rolled into a single negotiating agenda, which was the Doha Development Round that was started in the capital, Doha, the capital city of Qatar. In 2001, there's no question, this agreement was in part a response to the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center. There was a very strong belief that improving the level of trade with full participation of both developed and developing world would contribute to both wealth and stability globally. That we needed to take another step forward to sharing of products and sharing of wealth, and that this would help to avoid radicalization in many different levels. The belief was that this negotiation would be a 4-year, half the time it took to negotiate the Uruguay round, and we would be done by the end of 2005. The ministerial conference achieved a couple of very specific outcomes. One is it did sign, and second, it created a basic framework text for agriculture trade liberalization, non-agriculture market access, NAMA, and trade-related intellectual property TRIPS. The essential agriculture deal, the elements had basically been structured, and again, while not written in detail, the basic elements had been agreed to, and likely whenever this deal is done, those basic elements will be present. Jump forward to 2003 for the Cancun ministerial. This was one where they had to shut down the entire sort of touristic area of Cancun and have barriers because the world who opposed globalization showed up to protest again, but they were able to keep the two sides separate. The level of emotion is, we can't forget, this was a place where a Korean farmer burned himself to death on the gates just outside of the control zone during the negotiations. There were breakthroughs of protests within the negotiation buildings as well. So we tend to think of this as a numbers game and trade flow, but there's also an emotional element that cannot be underestimated. Still, the scope of trade liberalization had largely been established. A basic text that had come forward had been written since the 2001 initiating conference. And the negotiations, though, did break down primarily because of deep conflict between the developed world and developing. Leading into Cancun, basically members of the WTO asked the United States and Europe to go create a basic agreement, and then everybody else would sign on. And then they met Brazil. Brazil was one of the major actors in the Cancun ministerial that said, no, this agreement must be more than the Uruguay round, and we must have more full participation. The developed world must reduce its trade distorting subsidies. It must address cotton. It must address the number of factors that are important to us. This was viewed as a triumph of the developing world to stop the process in Cancun, because it brought them fully to the center. The structures and negotiating groupings in the WTO changed that week and will never be the same again. It is not simply a deal to be cut between a couple of countries, and everybody else signs on. It was also clear that it wasn't going to get done, the deal, by mid-2005, and they were starting to be concerned that this round might be in trouble, because then President Bush only had fast-track authority from Congress until 2007. And already by 2003, that the process was starting to feel pressure. The United States then tabled a proposal to restart negotiations in 2004, focusing almost exclusively on market access and export subsidies. Something they wanted, market access to the world, and something that Europe was willing to talk about, reduction of export subsidies. Intense negotiations resulted in Europe agreeing to eliminate export subsidies, but over no specific time frame in 2004. And the Singapore issues were narrowed down really to focus just on trade facilitation. Building capacity of customs departments around the world to allow for efficient entry and exit of products consistent with world trade rules. 2004, the next ministerial in Geneva, developed and developing countries cooperated and have formed the first official framework agreement, and the date for completion was reset to the end of 2005. In 2005, ministerial in Hong Kong was successful because the European Union agreed to eliminate, and then all others signed on to eliminate export subsidies by 2013. Developed world members committed to actively facilitate imports of all agriculture goods from the least developed nations. And from a Canadian, I must say I am very embarrassed by Canada's conduct at this time, because Canada would not sign on to this component. It said, we will still not import any dairy, we will not import any poultry from any of the least developed nations to maintain our supply managed sectors in Canada. This was, for many of us Canadians, not just traders and exporters, but Canadian and world citizens, an embarrassing moment. And the completion date was extended to the end of 2006. Geneva 2006, the negotiating round failed to reach a substantive agreement on either domestic subsidies or import tariff reductions. Now we're starting to see the role of developing nations come to play. They wanted reduced trade distorting subsidies. The wealthy Northern Hemisphere countries had to begin reducing the use of taxation dollars to subsidize their industries. And again, in 2004, that was a fundamental breakdown. And for the first time, there was a real question whether the Doha round would succeed at all. The fast-track authority of the U.S. president was going to end within a year. A very short round was held in 2007 in Potsdam. It was short, but it was also viewed as being productive in that it was clarifying the areas of disagreement. And at the end, it broke down over developing countries not wanting to give as much market access as U.S. and Europe wanted, and domestic subsidies not being reduced by the United States and other developed countries as much as developing countries want. So it's really the team, the clarifying issues are really coming together. This was the 10 Days of Hope, 2008 in Geneva. Major concessions were made by the EU and US to cut total domestic subsidies. That was being sought by Brazil, India, and China. Still, at the end of the day, the negotiations that lasted for 11 days collapsed over disagreement over developing countries' use of their special safeguard mechanism to protect small farmers during harvest and critical marketing times. And it also stalled due to disputes between developing nations, primarily over non-market access, non-agriculture market access, or NAMA. The reality is, the negotiations broke down at agriculture access, but they likely broke down because of non-agriculture issues, which were really not well developed by the time the world met in Geneva. 5 days into these negotiations, I think all of the trade ministers around the world said 90% of the issues are within reach. 6 days or 4 days later, when the negotiations actually broke down, there were very strong emotional responses from some of the leading trade ministers of the world. One of them actually beginning to cry in the closing news conference by saying, "I don't know how we let this get away from us. We had the agreement in place 4 days ago, and then the agreement died." But India was a big part of this. The Minister of Commerce, Dr. Kamal Nath, had to go home to be part of a vote to survive his government, and came back and said, "I am not going to sell out millions of subsistence farmers. This deal's not going to go ahead." By the end of December, there was a So by December, a final framework agreement was distributed to all members, and basically it's a clarification of what happened in July, and again narrowing the ranges of agreement. And now I want to go through the elements of the agreement as it stands. Between December 2008 and to date, for agriculture, there's basically been no real change to the text. On tariffs, the current agreement and the text will say that tariffs will come down between 50 and 75%. So small tariffs of less than 20% will come down 50%. Tariffs over 100% will come down 70%. Overall, tariffs must decrease by 54% in developed countries and 36% in developing countries. For only some countries, and then only 1% of tariffs will be allowed to remain over 100%. So the day of tariffs as an effective quota will come to an end when this deal is eventually signed. Developing countries are required to cut tariffs 2/3 that rate of developed countries. In-quota tariffs must be reduced by 50%, with no remaining tariffs in quota to be more than 10%. This only affects tariff rate quotas that were in place prior to the beginning of the Doha round. If there's a creation of any new TRQs out of the Doha round, all in-quota tariff rates will be zero. So I'll get to that with sensitive products. Tariff simplification. All tariffs must be converted to ad valorem, or percentage of product value tariffs, and then reduced according to this formula. Europe has some special flexibility where, in those cases where tariff simplification ends up creating more tariffs than they had before. And this is looked at as being a 10-year transition for Europe to continue to simplify their tariff matrix system. As I said before, there's only room for 1% of normal tariff lines to remain above 100%, and that is only for countries whose tariffs currently, at least 30% of tariffs, are already above 100%. Now, Canada and Japan, by the way, don't agree with this because they have a few tariffs lines that they want to protect incredibly. Rice and certain vegetables in Japan, dairy and poultry in Canada. But still, these are the text agreements so far. Sensitive products. All WTO members, developed and developing, will be allowed to select 4% of all tariff lines and reduce them by only 2/3, 1/2, or 1/3 of the formula. But in exchange, they must provide an additional 3, 3.5, or 4% of access of domestic consumption with no or very low tariffs. So take a look at 8 million tons. That's 240,000 tons of free access would be required by the European Union for beef, and 23 million tons would be 1 million tons of pork would be required at zero tariff access to Europe if this is signed overnight. Significant new access, a real gain in market access, even if Europe would claim beef and pork, for example, to be sensitive products. Where countries have 30% of agricultural products covered by the highest tariff levels, they can put another 2% of tariff lines as special, but they have to increase their free access by another 0.5% of imports. And again, sensitive products with tariffs remaining over, even after the reduction, sensitive products with import tariffs above 100%, there would have to be another 0.5% of consumption free tariff access. So that's the concept of this. There's a payment for every protection. Every time you have protection, you have to provide a little more access with zero tariff. Special safeguards. Developed countries will no longer be able to use temporary tariffs to protect against import surges or temporary reductions in domestic pricing. So the Japan increase from 38.5% to 50%.